Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Catherine Yoon, part of the FHEO Speaker Series team. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Documents of Defense, Racially Restrictive Covenants in Harlem 1904 to 1913. As many in this audience will know, racially restrictive covenants were agreements that prohibited property owners from selling or leasing to individuals based on race. They were enforced throughout the country and played a large role in creating and maintaining segregated communities. Before Harlem became the center of African American history and culture we know today, it too had restrictions on the entry of African Americans. And its transition tells a fascinating story about how and why communities change. As the New York Times reported, quote, in 1910, Blacks constituted about 10% of Central Harlem's population. By 1930, the beginnings of the Great Migration from the South and the influx from downtown Manhattan neighborhoods where Blacks were less welcome transformed them into a 70% majority, end quote. The poet Langston Hughes wrote about Harlem in his autobiography. Harlem was like a great magnet for the Negro intellectual, pulling him from everywhere. Or perhaps the magnet was New York, but once in New York, he had to live in Harlem, for rooms were hardly to be found elsewhere, end quote. So today we're honored to host a speaker who can give us further insights into this chapter of history. Dr. Kevin Magruder is an assistant professor of history at Antioch College. His new book, Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, 1890 to 1920, was published this June by Columbia University Press. The book has received praise for its incredible research and fascinating characters, and for being a fact-filled book enlivened by personal accounts. Dr. Magruder, in addition to being a scholar, has worked for many years in the field of nonprofit community development, including as a program director at Local Initiative Support Corporation and director of real estate development with the Abyssinian Development Corporation based in Harlem. Dr. Magruder earned a BA in economics from Harvard University, an MBA in real estate finance from Columbia University, and a PhD in US history from City University in New York. We're very excited to hear Professor Magruder speak. Please help me welcome Kevin Magruder.
Catherine, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. My very first job as an adult in July of 1979 was with the Department of Community Development in Cleveland, working on a HUD program, the 312 loan program, where we made loans to people who were renovating their houses in Cleveland. And so my interest in housing goes way back, both personally and professionally. What I'm going to do today is talk about a portion of this book that focuses on the restrictive covenant movement in Harlem, and the subtitle, Racially Restrictive Covenants, 1904 to 1913. That may sound like an odd periodization there, but you'll understand where those years come from in a few minutes. But first, just some geography, kind of just to get you situated in terms of context. Manhattan was New York City until 1898, when the Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens joined with Manhattan to become Greater New York. So before that, Manhattan was the city. And during the period that I'm looking at, that consolidation is still working its way through, both in terms of city administration, real estate markets, all of those things. So this is from 1905, the map of Manhattan. You can't quite see that, but that's a ward map politically, Manhattan at that time was divided into wards. And Harlem was the area. Is there a pointer in this? No pointer. Okay. This area. This is Central Park. Above Central Park is what we call Harlem now. Harlem has a very vague, even now, it's a vague boundary and always did. So when we look at New York City's development, New York settled by the Dutch in terms of European settlement. It was Native Americans, of course, that were there before, but Europeans settled it in the 1600s. It's New Netherland, and the city is New Amsterdam. Harlem was a village. It was called New Harlem, and the city was at the bottom tip of Manhattan. New Harlem was pretty much most of that area toward the upper tip. The English took over in 1664, and New Amsterdam became New York. New Harlem became Harlem. It was a village. It was not part of the city. Didn't become part of the city until the 1870s. It was a farming village, and it was a place where wealthy New Yorkers had their summer homes. So Alexander Hamilton, actually, he had an estate, a year-round estate, that the building is still there, the Hamilton Grange, which is now at where 141st Street is. The Black presence in the area was there almost from the beginning. The Dutch brought enslaved Africans to New York in the 1600s. It's believed that most of those original people who were enslaved were eventually freed. They sued for their freedom and became free. And I'm kind of giving you that backdrop to say that even though when we think about Harlem and the period we're looking at, a lot of times we think of the arrival of black people to that area. But what I'm getting at is black people were always there, almost. And what we're looking at is the arrival of greater numbers of them. But there was a presence there. And there's some reasons why that presence was able to continue to exist. The Harlem, when it becomes part of the city, it begins to be developed more or less like a bedroom community. So the brownstones, if you've been to Harlem, you see the brownstones on the side streets. Those were built in the 1880s, 1890s. They're single-family homes, people who own businesses downtown, manufacturing companies. Those were the people who were living there. Often they had a servant or two. That's what Harlem was. And when you said Harlem in the 1890s, it was like saying Scarsdale now in New York. That's what it meant for most people. The dominant image was one of upper middle class wealth. There were poor people there, white and black, all along. 1904 begins to bring a change. One of the reasons why black people always had a presence there is because it paid to have black tenants. So the Langston Hughes quote that Catherine read, what Langston Hughes was getting at is that, and I'm sure you know, is that housing segregation paid. Because if you can limit somebody's housing choices, you can charge those people with limited choices more. And that's what happened. That's why black people were attracted to real estate investors. So when you look at newspapers from the 1880s, in some cases there'll be ads for colored tenants for buildings in the area of Harlem. And that reason is they were usually charged maybe 25 to 50% more than a white person would be charged. 1904, that arrangement begins to change. By that time, there was a black community. For those of you who know Harlem, if you know where the housing complex Lenox Terrace is now at 135th Street, it's across from Harlem Hospital. Before that was there, those were low-scale walk-up tenement apartment buildings, probably 3 or 4 stories, 6 to 10 units. 135th, 134th, 133rd were substantially black, not all black, in 1900. And in a way, that's kind of what got me interested in this project, because the dominant narrative focuses on particularly the Great Migration and the arrival of greater numbers of black people to Harlem, which is accurate, but what gets missed is that black people were already there. And then when you start asking, well, why, that money issue helps to answer that. Money also plays a role in the context of events that lead to people feeling they need to have documents of defense or restrictive covenants. 1904, the subway system opened, the first subway in New York, what's now the Lenox Avenue line, the 2 and the 3 subway line. And so that 135th area, that block that I'm talking about, there was a subway stop that was going to be right at 135th and Lenox Avenue. So since the 1880s, real estate owners in Harlem had been advocating for a subway because they were saying their land was going to be useless if people couldn't get to it. At that time, the nickname for Harlem, the pejorative nickname was Goat Town, because 125th Street, the main thoroughfare, had grass growing in it. And Harlem did have a lot of rock outcroppings in addition to the brownstones. There was a lot of vacant land. Many of the blocks were undeveloped. And the real estate investors are saying, well, nobody's ever going to develop this if they can't get to it. And so the subway allows that to happen. So it opens up Harlem to white residents who want to move there, but also to black residents. What's been happening during this period is that from the end of the Civil War onward, there's a migration of black people from the South, in the South to larger cities, from the South to the North. And New York is right on the railroad line. You can get to it by boat, and so people are moving there. So in 1870, New York had a black population of 13,000, and this is when New York is Manhattan. So if we look at Manhattan's growth, by 1880, that's gone to 20,000. By 1900, that's 36,000. And to people living through it, because New York's population is growing as well, they probably didn't particularly see anything unusual, because the black population is always around 2 or 3% of the total. So the subway opens, black people continue to move to New York. The phenomenon that Langston Hughes is discussing is about to happen. And so the subway opens, and at that time in New York City, residential leases were up on April 30th. And so May 1st was known as moving day. Everybody was moving, almost. And a lot of times poor people were moving because often property owners were offering a month's free rent or 2 months free rent. So people would move, get the free rent, then move again. And so 1904 moving day is different, though. And the New York Herald, May 2nd, 1904, had this article. It says, "There is nothing but trouble in a section of Harlem where a community of Negroes that has grown rapidly in a few years is being made to disintegrate and move on through the concerted action of landlords. 100 families will be on the move today, and 600 other families are perilously near eviction." And what the article is talking about is an attempt to evict these people that are on those blocks that I mentioned, 135th, 134th. And it's not clear whether it was successful or not, but what is clear is that there was a black response to that. And that really sets the stage for the making of Black Harlem. And the response was black investors began leasing and buying property in that same area that white investors were trying to evict people from. And there's a small handful of white property owners who are assisting them, and that's something that I didn't expect. And what they're doing is, in some cases, helping them to finance their purchases. So black person wants to buy a 10-unit apartment building. Mortgage financing was not available in a uniform way like it is now. And so they would have had a hard time. Often estates were loaning people money, but black property purchasers were probably going to have a hard time. So these sellers help black people to buy the property. And so at the same time that some are being evicted, there are black owners that are beginning to get property in this area. And one of the key figures in this is another picture of Upper Manhattan. And you can see in the center, Central Park there. Central Park was built in the 1850s, and that's a whole nother real estate story. There's a great book called The Park and the People by Elizabeth Blackmar that talks about that, because that's another. They declared it blighted, even though there was a Seneca Village, which was a settlement of black and white people that was there from, I believe, about the 1820s as an amenity, but that's another story. This is another picture of Harlem, the area that I'm talking about, and then this is Philip Payton. He was born in Westfield, Massachusetts in 1876. His parents were entrepreneurs. He came to New York City in the 1890s, lived in the Midtown area. He characterizes himself as the black sheep of the family. Both of his brothers eventually went to Yale. His sister became a teacher. He dropped out of high school. But he came to New York in 1899 to seek his fortune, ended up working as a porter in a real estate office, and from that job got the idea about real estate investing. So the year before this eviction notice had happened, he formed a partnership called the Afro-American Realty Company. And that partnership, after this eviction and these purchases, he's one of the people who is buying property in response to these eviction notices. So that's it's the spring of 1904. July of 1904, he incorporates the Afro-American Realty Company. And the picture on the right of this slide is the cover of the prospectus of the Afro-American Realty Company. It's kind of a pamphlet-sized cover. And he talks about this phenomenon, this series of events that's happening. And so he says, when the movement was started to put colored people out of West 135th Street, this co-partnership, being unable to lease any houses on this street, voted to buy and did buy 2 5-story flats valued at $50,000, and thereby stemmed the tide, which, had it been successful in West 135th Street, would surely have extended to West 134th Street, which is almost entirely given over to our people. And so he's basically saying this is why we're doing this. And then he goes on to talk about the mission of the organization. He says, the idea that Negroes must be confined to certain localities can be done away with. The idea that it is not practical to put colored and white tenants together in the same house can be done away with. By this time, he's in the inner circle of Booker T. Washington's National Negro Business League, which was a network that had chapters all across the country. It's really Booker T. Washington's eyes and ears. People called Booker T. Washington behind his back the wizard, because if somebody was talking about him, he could find out about it, and they didn't know why. But it's because of that network. And so Payton is part of that inner circle. And so when he begins to buy this property, there is a letter that comes from Booker T. Washington's office. It's not clear whether it's from Washington or Emmett Scott. Emmett Scott was Booker T. Washington's right-hand man. He's one of the officers of the Afro-American Realty Company, so they're good friends. The letter says, I have read in yesterday's World how you turn the tables on those who desire to injure the race, and wish to congratulate you on this instance of business enterprise and race loyalty combined. And so what he is doing is exactly what Booker T. Washington is encouraging black people to do. Own property, use your economic base to assert your rights, even though Booker T. Washington was a lot more complex than the image, the dominant narrative of him. So Payton makes a splash. He knew how, if he was alive now, he would be blogging, he'd be doing websites, all of those kinds of things. He's using the media, and he gets the attention of the white press. So a few days after he announces this is happening, the New York Times has an editorial about this. And it says, it was headline, to make color line costly in New York, Afro-American Realty Company formed, quote, to depress real estate values in order to bring desirable apartment houses into the market as homes for Negroes promises to be a business mistake. And the editorial then goes on to predict that white residents would leave and that the number of unobjectionable Negro tenants standing ready to take their places is not great enough to prevent neighborhood deterioration. There's a lot in that quote. But one of the things that is happening here is that race is being written into housing. And I want to use a metaphor. I'm kind of tweaking a metaphor that Khalil Muhammad, about 5 years ago, he published a book called The Condemnation of Blackness, where it looks at how did criminality get intertwined with blackness. And he looks at the period of the late 1800s and the way that social science is used to affirm what a really prejudice is. And so people look at poor outcomes of black people and they see what they want to see, which is black triflingness is the word my parents would use, but they see black disarray, and so social science writes into it that this is inherent to blackness. So that's what he means by race being written into crime. Race is being written into housing in the same way. So in 1908, the real estate industry across the country professionalizes. They formed something called the National Real Estate Exchanges. And then that eventually becomes the National Association of Realtors. Segregation is their watchword, that they believe that segregation is what is required for stability. They have a code of ethics for their brokers that their brokers cannot sell in ways that are going to challenge segregation. If you are black and you want to be a broker, you cannot be part of their organization. They trademarked, in the 1940s, they trademarked the term realtor. And what it really means is white licensed real estate brokers. And so that's the extent that they have written race into housing. Black real estate brokers create a separate organization, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, and they use a different term, realtists, to talk about them. And so this is what is happening right at this time. So 1904, you get this collision in Harlem, but nationally, these things are happening too. And what's driving it is, this is the first period where substantial numbers of black people are moving to northern cities. Before this, in most northern cities, there was some segregation, but the lines were blurry, the practices were blurry. It really depended on the place, the time. Even in New York before this period, black people lived in a lot of different places. They couldn't live just anywhere, but it was fuzzy. Those lines become hardened during this, and the industry helps that to happen. And so that's what is happening in Harlem. Philip Payton, the next time he makes the media scene is 2 years later in Harlem, in 1906. He leases a 15-unit apartment building on 151st Street between Amsterdam and Broadway. It's an all-white building. And contrary to what he said in the prospectus, he said black and white people can live in the same building. And that was happening before this period. But what's happening in the hardening is that is being left behind. And he seems to have left that belief behind as well, because he buys this 15-unit building. It's occupied by white residents, and he evicts them or says they're going to have to go. And that's how it makes the news. This was also in the Times, and the headline was, "Negro Invasion Threat Angers Flat Dwellers." And the Times they interview people in the building who, it's a very sympathetic article saying these people are going to have to move. Nowhere in it is there any discussion of could black and white people live together. By this time, it seems that people have concluded that buildings are going to be all black or all white. Payton does not get a chance to bring this forward because the building was purchased in August, a month after he bought it. It was purchased. His lease agreement had a clause where he would get paid if it was purchased, so he got $1,000 and walked away. And I'm assuming that the old tenants remained in the building. That $1,000, that's about $20,000 today, so it was a substantial bit of money. There are other, but what's happening during this period is it's almost like this jockeying. Are white people going to control Harlem? Are black people going to control Harlem? Later in this same year, in 1906, another purchase happens, this one on 137th Street. And again, the white tenants are evicted. In this case, the purchaser is a white woman, Hannah Theobald. And when I looked at the property records, that property had changed hands 4 times in the 2 years before she purchased it. So there's speculation happening, contrary to what the Times talked about. And there's what happens when neighborhoods are changing like this is, as white people flee, prices do drop for a short period, but as black people arrive, those prices go up because the owners of the property know those people are desperate, and that's what is happening on 137th Street. That building also gets bought before black people can move in, and a couple months later, the first restrictive covenant appears that I found in Harlem in February of 1907. And just to give you a sense, I think like restrictive covenant sounds like dry document, what could it, whatever. And I know this doesn't, you can't really see it, but this is from microfilm. But it really unlocks the voices of people who didn't leave records, didn't leave diaries. They're really explaining why they're doing what they're doing in this document. And so this 137th Street document, this is what it says. The white tenants in the property known and described as 106 and 108 West 137th Street were dispossessed, and said premises leased and rented to tenants of the Negro race for the purpose of compelling adjoining neighboring owners to purchase the same property to protect their holding. So there's this idea that if a property is purchased, it's to almost like as blackmail to get white people to buy that building back. And then they go on to say, and this is where they seem to be anticipating the legal challenges. Catherine mentioned that these were enforced by law, but there are challenges that are coming up, and they seem to be aware of this. They say there is no desire to preclude or prevent Negroes or citizens of African descent solely because of their race and color from occupying any of the properties owned by the parties hereto. The sole desire and purpose and object of the parties hereto being to secure a resumption and continuance of the rentals obtained prior to the introduction of Negro tenants into 106 and 108 West 137th Street. And that is really meeting the real estate industry's analysis of what happens when black people get to neighborhoods, because their analysis is saying it creates instability in the market. And so what they're saying, it's not about race, we want to stabilize the market. And I suspect that they really sincerely believe that. And this particular document, and because of that, it has a deadline. But actually, even before I get to that, they say the deadline, this will be a 10-year term for this agreement. And then they go on to say what it is requiring for that owner. So this is in the deed of the property. And so even if the property is sold, the next buyer, from their point of view, will have to adhere to this. And they say that these owners of these properties will not permit or cause to be permitted or suffer or cause to be suffered, either directly or indirectly, the said premises to be used or occupied in whole or in part by any Negro, mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon of either sex whatsoever, or any person popularly known and described as a Negro, mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon of either sex as a tenant, subtenant, guest boarder, or in any other way, manner, or capacity whatsoever, excepting only that one family occupying an entire house or an entire flat or an entire apartment may employ one negress or one female mulatto or one female quadroon or one female octoroon as a household servant, performing only the duties ordinarily performed by a household servant. This covenant and restriction may be proceeded on for an injunction and for damages against the party or parties or person or persons who for the time being own, occupy, or are in possession of the said premises and violating or attempting or threatening to violate this covenant or restriction. So they're laying out their purposes, and some of that language probably sounds odd to us because quadroon, octoroon, those terms we associate probably with the South more than with the North. And what this is getting at is the North has its own brand of racism, its own hierarchy, its own segregation policies that prior to this period were informal, but they're becoming formal. And this kicks off a series of restrictive covenants that begin to be put in place. So the covenant I read was February of 1907, May of 1907, and in that covenant there were, for a covenant to have power, it needs to have numbers. And so 23 people on that block signed that covenant. And there was kind of an implicit belief that you had to have a certain number. Some people said half, but it some of it is almost like folklore or whatever. The next covenant, so that was early in 1907. The next covenant, May of 1907 on 140th Street. And that covenant is very generic. It doesn't have any explanation, doesn't have a deadline. It's a block that was primarily apartment buildings, and so it seems like there may be some reason that because of that, it's structured differently. June of 1910, one of the largest covenants was recorded, because these are all with the city register in New York, which is the equivalent of the county recorder. 99 owners of properties on 136th Street, it's between Lenox and 8th, so that's 2 blocks. They signed this covenant. And the language is pretty similar to the language that I read. What is interesting on this covenant is, and you can't see that, but it has a witness, it has the owner, and on the left it's a witness, and that's the same name. John G. Taylor is the witness there. And so by this time, this is 1910, John G. Taylor has become the leader for the covenant movement. He was a retired police officer who had moved to Harlem in 1902 and bought a brownstone, he and his wife. And it's interesting because he moved to Harlem from Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village was an older black neighborhood in the early 1800s. That area was known as Little Africa. And when I looked at the block where John G. Taylor lived, it was interesting because half of the block was black and half of the block was white. And so I kind of imagine him thinking he's moving to Harlem to get away from them. And then he gets there, and what's happening is they're moving beyond the boundaries that they had been restricted to by kind of a gentleman's agreement. And so he's retired now. And so he really is spending all of his time, it seems like, organizing people. Because this takes, if you're going to get 99 people to sign something that's going to be put in their deeds, that's a substantial amount of organizing that happens. There is an organization behind it, the Harlem Property Owners Protective League, that he becomes a leader in. And that is the league that is behind so the covenant becomes a boilerplate. So it makes it easier for people to do. And John G. Taylor plays an important role in that. Over the next few months, several other covenants are put in place. And when we look at where they are, so that was 136th Street, and that included Taylor's building. 135th Street, in December of 1910, 13 owners signed a covenant. February of 1911, 132nd Street, 42 owners. And December 1911, 66 owners signed a covenant. And then if I go back to this map, so this map is showing the location of those covenants. So the area we're talking about is a fairly small area. It's kind of about 10 blocks from north to south. Let's say 132nd Street to about 142nd Street, east to west, 8th Avenue to Lenox Avenue. But there are covenants sprinkled in there. Within this period, though, the black community has exploded in Manhattan. So in 1900, black population in Manhattan was 36,000. By 1910, the black population is 60,000. So before this period of black people moving there, they would have moved to the Midtown area that was called the Tenderloin or the San Juan Hill area, roughly from 23rd up to like 67th Street in that area. But now they're coming to Harlem, and Philip Payton is playing a role in helping them to get there. 1913 ends up being a pivotal year. There were a series of public meetings, and the result of these public meetings is a case that is a challenge. John G. Taylor is in the newspaper saying, we're going to affirm the legitimacy of these restrictive covenants very soon. And a case comes forward. It was Morlath versus Greenbaum. Caroline Morlath had bought a 10-unit building on 137th Street. She was a widow. She lived in the building, and she rented out apartments to people. That was her income. And by this time, that area, she says in the affidavit, was becoming predominantly black, and white people weren't renting, so she rents to black people. That block was covered by, that's the first block where the covenants were. So it was covered by covenant. Raphael Greenbaum, her next-door neighbor, says, you violate the covenant, I'm taking you to court. He takes her to court and asks for $10,000 in damages. So this case is going on through the summer of 1913. And both parties are giving affidavits, and the core of what they're trying to surmise is how many black people are in the area. That Caroline Morlath is saying all the stores black-owned on the avenue, black people are everywhere. If I didn't rent to black people, I wouldn't rent to anybody. And Raphael Greenbaum is saying, no, she's the first one to rent to black people. So they have expert brokers come in, and it seems like this is coming to some kind of conclusion. But then in the case file in the New York Supreme Court, there is this photograph on the left, which is used for the cover of my book also. In the case file, you can't really see that. There's two little boys standing in knickerbockers pointing at this building, and the building has an X on it. And the X is pointing to a sign on Raphael Greenbaum's building that says 5-room apartments, all improvements to respectable colored tenants. So Caroline Morlath, she requests that the case be dismissed, quote, since the plaintiff is now committing a breach of contract he seeks to enforce. So rather than settle the issue, it left it, kind of muddy. You probably know that covenants were honored in different parts of the country until 1948, when the Shelley v. Kramer case, the Supreme Court ruled that they violated Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so this period is when they're being used not so effectively. And one of the reasons why they're not effective is because Harlem, the white population was very diverse. They were not united. The fact that black people could buy property and white people were willing to sell meant that all white people did not think they shouldn't be there. they were also new. Harlem was not an old neighborhood, so they didn't have that kind of unity that you have in Chicago. But you also don't have the bombing that you get in Chicago, because that's literally what is happening in Chicago by the teens, where black people are trying to move in. So covenants, even though they're definitely a negative kind of element, kind of when we pull back, they're really a genteel tool that in Harlem really didn't work. And there's the broader story of Harlem becoming a black community, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer session. So, thank you. Are there questions, comments?
Just before we get the in-person questions, I just want to mention that we will be taking email questions also for people who are watching by webcast. So please email your questions to FHEO speakerseries@hud.gov. And please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bernard Morton. I was wondering if you can talk about how these private covenants laid the foundation for their incorporation into federal policy via the FHA.
So when I mention race being written into housing, so from 2015, we look at this as animus driving it. And I'm not saying there aren't people who are motivated by that. But a fair amount of these people really do believe that this is firm social science that is driving this, even though, like we know now, so they believe that if black people are in these neighborhoods, there'll be criminality. So when we look at when FHA gets started, when the federal government begins to move into housing, those people working in those agencies, they've grown up through this, with this belief. And this is still something that we live with today, because there's not an understanding of this is what. So sometimes people, it's a mystery, why is segregation still here? Let's look back at the institutional supports that, and I know you had a speaker recently, Richard Rothstein, who talked about that is, so when you talk about institutional racism, a lot of times people think that's rhetoric, but it's not. And so the federal government becomes the institution, but they're grounding it on social science. And so if you were to go to schools of sociology at this probably early 1900s, other academic areas are supporting this. And so as far as they're concerned, these are best practices. And so they're part of that. It would probably be the unusual person who is going to challenge that, because in a way they will be an outlier during that time. So it's firmly kind of incorporated into people's belief systems.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Barbara Haley, Office of Policy Development and Research. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really super. I was hoping you could tell us more about the year 1948. And the reason why I'd like to hear more about this is that racially restrictive covenants were a going thing in my hometown of Tacoma, Washington, until 1963, when the city council went and outlawed them for that particular jurisdiction. And it was highly controversial at that time. The real estate industry vigorously, publicly opposed the removing those restrictions. And there was also, how could I put it, a less visible element that oppose this through the use of the fist and the gun.
And those were the more unified neighborhoods. So, and that's what I mean. So, like, for us, unity, might always seem like a positive thing, but when you have violence, and there's some books that talk about it, that's a pretty high stakes action that you don't take unless you feel you've got your neighbors behind you. So what you're getting at is the enduring nature of these covenants, regardless of what the law does. And so even prior to 1948, in the Shelley versus Kramer case, as they were challenged, there was always a question of, are these just private agreements? Should people be able to do what they want in private, or does the government have a role? With that case, what the Supreme Court was looking at, their question was, they were looking at the enforcement. They weren't saying you can't have a covenant in your deed, which it sounds like doublespeak, but they're looking at, can you enforce it? And so that's really what they're looking at. They said, does the enforcement of a racially restrictive covenant violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And they concluded that it did because it restricted what people could do with their property. Now, what you're getting at is that they said that, but what happens at the local level? People do what they want to do to some extent, as long as the local authorities will allow them and as long as nobody is willing to pay money to take them to court. So even with the Greenbaum case, if you think about that, why did he go to court when he knew that there were black people in that neighborhood? Why did he try to make it seem like she's the first person to rent to black people? Because there's no way that that is true. Particularly when he had a sign and he starts running. Why is he there? And I believe he's there because I don't have evidence, but I suspect that John G. Taylor's organization paid for that to happen, to challenge it. And so what you're describing in terms of the brokers in the 1960s, unless there's somebody who is going to challenge being kept out of a neighborhood, then those covenants, and they still are indeed. What the Supreme Court says is you can't enforce them. But they have it's more than symbolic. They have a power because there's a book that Larry Pearl told me about racially restricted covenants called Saving the Neighborhood by Richard Brooks and Carol Rose. And what he talks about is this, they send a signal to people in the neighborhood. This is the kind of neighborhood we want. And so,
and in Tacoma, it worked. I mean, the whole north end of Tacoma was 100% white until 1964.
Right. And so it all gets back to when we look at, the question, well, why is it so enduring? It's because a lot of people are working to make sure that it continues to endure. And even a covenant that has technically no legal power can have a lot of informal power to somebody who buys a property, and they see that. They're not a lawyer. They say, oh, I don't know if I want to, get into that and put myself out to be sued. They're not going to look at necessarily the research. So there's a way that has power. They don't require that they be removed. I know some people have removed them. I believe William Rehnquist, it was found he had a covenant in I think it was a vacation home, and he had it removed. But most people probably aren't going to go to that trouble. And so it's almost like the internment case, the Kamatsa case with Japanese internment, where they talk about it sitting as a loaded gun. It's a little bit different, but that covenant it's sending a signal to people who, if you're a black couple and you're moving to that neighborhood, you've got to make a decision. Do you want to be like Lorraine Hansberry's father and move to that Chicago neighborhood, I'm in a lot of trouble, or do you want to move somewhere else where you can just move in and do what you want to do?
Yeah, I could be wrong about this, but the real estate agents in Tacoma had a slightly different argument, which was they wanted to maintain the property values in the north end of the town.
But that's what I mean about the social science.
Not to raise rents on the tiny black population there.
But that's what the social science argument is, that black people bring disarray, and disarray brings lower property values. So as long as we keep them out, that's exactly what that first covenant I read, they were saying, we want to keep them out so we can restabilize this real estate market. So 50 years later, they're doing the same thing in Tacoma, really, probably, phrasing a little bit different. But yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Portia Hemphill in Office of Field Policy and Management. I had a couple of questions pertaining to, a couple of short questions pertaining to this idea of cooperation in Harlem. So you spoke about, you actually told us about an ad the ad in which it specified that it wanted something akin to respectable black people in the area. So I want to know, in this framework of cooperation, were there any notable white realtors who would rent to those that aren't respectable in the conventional sense? And for black realtors, what was the situation for, I want to know more about how blacks who weren't considered respectable, where did they live? What happened there? And who rented to them?
So first, the first part of the question, so those initial purchases in 1904 are all, well, 3 of the 4 white people who sell to black people initially, and these are strategic because if they didn't happen, those evictions might have stood. August Ruff, Louis Parchfeld, Charles and Katie Kroll. Charles Kroll was a stable owner. August Ruff was a builder. Louis Parchfeld, a metal worker. None of them are brokers. They're probably investors. So, they're middling business people. They've invested in some property, and they sell to blacks. And one of the things I argue is that New York had a large German-American community. They had German singing societies. And so I suspect that these German-Americans identified more with German Americans than with the hostile white neighbors that they had. And they probably saw these black people as they saw themselves in these black people, because you have James C. Thomas, a black undertaker. He's one of the people, is one of the officers in Philip Payton's company. You have Payton, who has, pulled himself up, created this company. And so that's what I mean about the cooperation part of it. The second part of your question about respectability, that this first wave are what we would call the black middle class as it existed then, when the professional class is small. But there were already black working class people there, and they arrive in greater numbers by the latter part of the teens. And in some cases, they're in Payton's buildings, they're in other black owners' buildings, and they begin protesting against the higher rents that Payton is, because they're trying to make money. So they're not giving them reduced rents. They are charging more, just like the white owners were. A. Philip Randolph is a student at City College then, and he begins organizing against them. There are rent strikes. There's another new book that came out by Shannon King. It's called Whose Harlem Is It Anyway? That talks about that, and it's the protest movement. And so I'm focusing on kind of the real estate business side, and that's definitely part of it. In terms of white brokers, there are some. They don't play significant roles, and the question is, it's not clear, and this is very hard to figure out, are they blockbusters? Are they putting a black person on, in terms of what the Times is saying, to make all the white people leave and then they can make money, or is it a sympathetic role? And that's pretty hard to figure out because they're small and they're at a level that they don't leave documents. So so there may have been. So that there is some cooperation going on within the conflict at different levels. So,
Thank you.
Hi, just a moment. We have one last time for questions, so well, if we can make it one last quick question.
Sure.
Thank
Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
I'm Mindy Turbov. Kevin and I go back about
From Cleveland.
38 years.
Yes.
So I'm really thrilled to see, I run the Choice Neighborhoods program. So I'm really thrilled to see what you've done since you left to go to Columbia. But I had a question because I used to do a little research myself and used to find in the real estate ads in Chicago prices that were, as you said, different rates. And I would find that the rate for blacks was the most, and then the rates for Jews was the next most, next lower down, and then everybody else got a different average rent. So I always found that rather interesting. So I would just wonder if you could speak to the racial covenants against Jews and Catholics as well, not necessarily in Harlem, but you seem to be incredibly well read on this subject, and I really didn't know there had been covenants against Catholics. And so, do you have any information on some of this so we could, you know, 'cause
Well, the covenant that William Rehnquist that was found. So when you get to high profile, as we've seen, people look into all your background, and that's what happened as I think when he was moving up to become Chief Justice, and it was a vacation home, and it wasn't against. I don't think it was against black people. I think it was against Jewish people in that, and so there is a. I didn't see that in Harlem in this area. The Jewish community, they moved from the Lower East Side to East Harlem beginning primarily in the 1880s. And then as they prosper, they begin to move west, but they're south of where I'm talking about. So
I'm just wondering also if you just know of anybody else who's done some research on this in terms of Jews and Catholics, because you know, because you're really smart
Saving
on
the
this subject.
Neighborhood
Saving the Neighborhood.
would be the book, and it came out in 2013. So it's by Richard Brooks and Mary, I believe her name is Rose, and it is specifically about the history of covenants nationwide.
Okay, thank
so
you.
that would be a really good
And
source.
I just wanted to share with you, we have a mutual friend in Phil Starr who, when his family bought a house in Scarsdale, there had been a covenant.
Yeah.
It couldn't be enforced. And so the people who bought the house, because that name didn't sound Jewish, basically ripped out the entire garden because they found out they were selling to Jews. I mean, this kind of stuff went on even after the covenant.
Well, that is an important point. So the German Americans that I talked about, I suspect because they had a lot of backup, they didn't fear retaliation. And so somebody who enforces a covenant, again, it's not necessarily animus. If they're in a community where they know there's going to be a consequence if they do, they're going to think twice about doing it.
Anyway, thank you. This was a
Thank
great,
you. It's good
great
seeing
lecture,
you.
and I'm going to come up and chat for a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that concludes today's event. Thank you for coming. We're sorry for the people who wanted to ask more questions, but Dr. Magruder will be around. We'll be outside the auditorium, and we can continue to ask questions.
Thank you.